The observation deck of the Galactic Conqueror Council stretched across 300 meters of crystalline transparency. Beyond the curved walls, stars hung like frozen tears against the infinite dark. Ambassador Scylla stood alone at the southern viewpoint, her four slender arms clasped behind her back in the traditional posture of contemplation. Her skin, pale green in the dim light, caught the reflection of distant suns and held them like captured fireflies.
Align the
She was
conduits
reviewing
now.
the files
Prepare for
again.
phase inversion.
The human
Reroute
files,
power to
2 centuries
stabilizers.
of
Hold
data
steady.
scrolled across the holo display that floated before her primary eyes. Reports, observations, risk assessments, all of it painted the same picture, confirmed the same truth that had been decided long ago when the galaxy first encountered them. Homo sapiens, classification apex predator, threat level extreme. Scylla's secondary eyes scanned the historical records while her primary vision remained fixed on the stars. She had read these files 1,000 times, but repetition brought comfort. The first contact reports were particularly fascinating. Humanity had barely achieved interstellar travel when the Conquered discovered them crude chemical rockets, primitive fusion drives, nothing that could threaten a civilization that had mastered gravity itself. But the Concorde's xenobiologists had been horrified. Earth was a death world, not the poetic kind that spawned resilient traders and determined explorers. The real kind. The kind where 98% of all species that had ever existed went extinct. Where life didn't just adapt to survive, it evolved to kill, to dominate, to conquer every ecological niche through violence and competition. Humans were the apex of that nightmare. They had climbed to the top of their world's food chain, not through strength or speed or natural weapons, but through something far more dangerous. Intelligence, tool-making, cooperation in the pursuit of lethality. The holodisplay showed images from Earth's history, humans throwing sharpened sticks at beasts 10 times their size, humans setting coordinated fires to drive prey into kill zones, humans developing agriculture not for peace, but to support larger populations capable of organized warfare. By the time they developed nuclear weapons, they had already perfected the art of killing on an industrial scale. Seleth let one hand drift through the holographic data, and the display shifted to show the Conquered's response 2 centuries past. The debate had lasted 7 full cycles. Some species advocated for immediate military containment. Others suggested cultural integration, slow assimilation into galactic norms. A few paranoid voices called for preemptive sterilization of the entire planet. In the end, wisdom prevailed. The containment protocols were elegant in their simplicity. Humanity would be allowed to join the galactic community, but under strict supervision. Their technology would be limited through carefully managed trade restrictions. Their military expansion would be monitored through embedded observers disguised as diplomatic liaisons. Their access to faster-than-light travel would be controlled through proprietary jump gate networks that could be shut down at a moment's notice. Most importantly, they would be kept ignorant of their own containment. The galaxy would smile and welcome them as equals, while ensuring they could never become the threat their biology suggested they might be. And it had worked. For 200 years, humanity remained a minor trading species. They operated small merchant fleets, maintained diplomatic outposts on a dozen worlds, and showed no signs of military ambition beyond basic system defense. They seemed content to be just another voice in the Conquered, grateful for the opportunity to trade and learn and slowly peacefully integrate into galactic civilization. Seleth allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The containment protocols represented everything the Conquered stood for: wisdom over violence, patience over reaction, controlled integration over fearful isolation. They had tamed the apex predators, domesticated them without the beasts even realizing they wore collars. Her communicator chimed softly against her thorax, a priority message from Kepler's Haven, the trading station she administered in the outer territories. Selith's primary hands reached out and accepted the transmission, while her secondary hands continued to navigate through the human files. The message was marked urgent, but Selith wasn't concerned. She had administered Kepler's Haven for 32 standard years. The station saw perhaps 3 or 4 genuine emergencies per decade, usually medical situations or reactor malfunctions. Nothing her experienced staff couldn't handle. She opened the message, and her world began to crack. The communication was from Senior Coordinator Thelvin, her second in command. His usually calm voice carried an edge of panic that Selith had never heard before. "Ambassador, we have an emergency. Krell warships have entered the system. 53 vessels. They're demanding our surrender and threatening to fire on the station if we don't comply within 1 standard hour. I've evacuated all civilians to the emergency shelters, but our defensive screens won't hold against that kind of firepower. The nearest Concord peacekeeping force is 3 weeks away, "Ambassador, we need help. We need it now." Salith's skin went pale, shifting from green to the color of ash. Her forearms trembled as she closed the human files and pulled up the tactical situation at Kepler's Haven. The display was worse than she feared. 53 Krell warships in standard battle formation arranged in a perfect blockade around her station. Each vessel was a Predator-class destroyer designed for exactly this kind of operation, overwhelming force against civilian targets. The Krell didn't conquer through military genius. They conquered through simple, brutal mathematics. Bring more ships than your enemy can possibly defeat. Make surrender the only rational choice. 3,000 Lyrian civilians were sheltering inside Kepler's Haven, her people, her responsibility, and the Krell were offering them 37 minutes before the bombardment began. Salith's mind raced through options with the clinical efficiency of 4 decades in diplomatic service. The Concord peacekeeping fleet could respond, but not in time. The nearest military force was 19 days away at maximum burn. Even if she called them now, they would arrive to find nothing but debris and captured survivors being processed for the Krell slave markets. Her secondary hands were already composing distress signals to the Concord emergency network when her primary hands hesitated over another option. There was one fleet closer. One group that could potentially reach Kepler's Haven before the Krell began their assault. The Human Patrol. Salith accessed the Concord's fleet tracking network. Yes, there it was, a small human merchant convoy reported in the Zeta sector just yesterday. The reports indicated 3, maybe 4 small vessels conducting standard trade operations. Nothing impressive, nothing powerful, but they were only 18 hours away at commercial cruise speed. She stared at the data, her primary and secondary vision, both locked on that single point of potential salvation. Humans, the contained species. The domesticated predators who had been kept carefully weak and dependent for generations. What could they possibly do against 53 Krell warships? The rational part of her mind screamed that this was pointless. Even if the humans responded immediately, even if they pushed their engines to dangerous speeds, they would arrive with 3 or 4 light merchant vessels against a full Krell battle group. It would be a massacre. The humans would be destroyed, and Kepler's Haven would fall anyway. But Salith was 37 minutes away from watching 3,000 of her people die or be enslaved. Rational thought was a luxury she no longer possessed. Her primary hands composed the message, while her secondary hands continued broadcasting to the Concord emergency network. She kept the communications simple, direct, stripped of diplomatic formality. "This is Ambassador Salith of the Lyrian Concord requesting immediate assistance. Kepler's Haven station is under attack by Krell forces. 53 warships. 3,000 civilians at risk. Please respond if you are able to render aid." She sent the message on all standard frequencies and one classified channel reserved for Concord security operations, a channel she wasn't technically authorized to use for contacting non-Concord military forces, but regulations seemed irrelevant when measured against 3,000 lives. The response came back in 47 seconds. "Message received, Ambassador Salith. This is the human vessel Meridian. We have your distress call and are plotting an intercept course to Kepler's Haven. Estimated arrival 18 hours. Hold your position. Protect your people. Do not surrender. Help is coming." The voice was female human and carried an absolute certainty that made no logical sense. Salith stared at the transmission data. One ship had responded. One human vessel, probably a converted freighter with minimal defensive capabilities, was promising to help against 53 warships. It was insane. It was impossible. It was the only hope she had. Salith forwarded the human response to Coordinator Thelvin with instructions to activate all defensive systems and buy as much time as possible. Then she sat down in her private observation chamber and waited, her forearms wrapped around herself in a posture of deep distress. The stars outside remained unchanged, indifferent to the small drama playing out among the living things that crawled between them. The journey to Kepler's Haven took Salith 16 hours through faster-than-light transit. She had abandoned her duties at the Concord Council without formal authorization, using emergency diplomatic protocols that would likely cost her position. None of that mattered. Her people were dying, and she would be with them when the end came. The emergency transport system materialized her on the command deck of Kepler's Haven 2 hours before the promised human arrival. The station's main operations center was a study in controlled chaos. 24 Lyrian technicians worked at their stations with the desperate focus of people who knew they were already dead, but refused to surrender to that knowledge. Coordinator Thelvin stood at the central tactical display, his usually vibrant skin dulled to a sickly gray. He turned when he sensed her arrival, and relief flooded his features. Ambassador, thank the roots you're here. Salith moved to his side, her primary eyes scanning the tactical situation, while her secondary eyes assessed the faces of her staff. They were afraid, but they were holding together. She felt a surge of pride mixed with the bitter knowledge that their courage might not matter in the end. Status report, she said quietly. Thelvin gestured to the holographic display. The Krell have been patient. Their commander, someone called Vexkarn, has been sending regular threats, but he hasn't opened fire. I think he's enjoying watching us panic. They're treating this like a game. How long until the humans arrive? 7 minutes, but Ambassador, Thelvin's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Our sensors are showing something impossible. The human response isn't what we expected. Before Salith could ask what he meant, the station's proximity alarms began screaming. Every technician in the operations center froze their attention, locked on displays that suddenly blazed with new data. The sensor operator, a young Lyrian named Vestal, spoke in a voice that shook with disbelief. Hyperspace signatures detected. Multiple contacts. Range 10 million kilometers and closing. How many contacts? Salith asked, though part of her already knew the answer would be terrible. Vestal's hands trembled as she worked her controls. Ma'am, the computer is having trouble processing the data. The signatures are too numerous, too tightly packed. Give me your best estimate. The young sensor operator looked up, and Salith saw confusion in her eyes that had nothing to do with the Krell. Over 200 ships, Ambassador, and they're all using human identification codes. The operations center went absolutely silent. 24 Lyrian faces turned towards Salith, seeking explanation, seeking reassurance, seeking any rational framework that could explain what their sensors were reporting. Salith had none to offer. 200 ships. The humans were supposed to have 3 or 4 small merchant vessels in this sector. The entire human trading fleet, according to Conquered Intelligence, numbered fewer than 80 ships galaxy-wide. Most were converted civilian transports. None were rated for serious military action. 200 ships meant the intelligence was wrong. 200 ships meant the containment protocols had failed. 200 ships meant everything Salith believed about humanity was a lie. Put it on the main display, she heard herself say. Show me what's coming. The holographic projector at the center of the operations room flickered and then resolved into an image that would be burned into Salith's memory for the rest of her life. They came out of hyperspace in perfect formation. Not the scattered, chaotic emergence of merchant vessels or the loose battle groups of typical military fleets. This was precision on a scale Salith had never witnessed. 215 ships dropped into real space simultaneously, their positions pre-calculated with such exactness that they formed geometric patterns too perfect for organic beings to have plotted. The sensor data streaming across her vision told a story that her mind struggled to accept. These were not merchant vessels. These were warships. The smallest ships in the formation were frigate class, their hulls bristling with weapon ports and sensor arrays. Destroyers formed the middle rank, sleek, predatory shapes that looked designed for nothing but violence. And at the center of the formation, massive dreadnoughts hung in space like ancient gods of war, their hulls so large that Kepler's Haven station could have fit inside one of their forward hangar bays. Every ship was painted in colors Salith had never associated with humanity. Dark gray hulls with sharp, angular lines, minimal running lights, profiles optimized not for trade or diplomacy, but for stealth and lethality. They looked like weapons. They looked like they had always been weapons and the galaxy had simply been too blind to see it. Coordinator Thelvin made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. The Krell are detecting them now. Look at their formation, they're breaking apart. They don't know what to do. Salith could see it on the tactical display. The Krell warships, which had maintained their perfect blockade for 18 hours, were suddenly scattering like insects exposed to light. Some were trying to form defensive positions. Others were calculating jump coordinates, preparing to flee. All of them radiated the electromagnetic signature of pure panic. A communication request appeared on Salith's personal display. Origin Human Fleet Flagship. Priority emergency. She accepted it with trembling hands. The holographic projection resolved into the image of a human female. She wore a dark uniform without any visible insignia of rank, her black hair cut short in a severely practical style. Her face was weathered, marked by thin scars that spoke of a life spent in dangerous places. But it was her eyes that captured Salith's attention. They were gray cold and completely devoid of mercy. Ambassador Salith, the human said. Her voice carried the same absolute certainty that had been in the initial message 18 hours ago. I am Admiral Theron Kavaris, commanding officer of the Human Response Fleet. We have arrived as promised. Your people are safe. Salith found her voice, though it sounded weak and small even to her own ears. Admiral, I don't understand. Where did this fleet come from? The Concord intelligence reports indicated The Concord intelligence reports indicated exactly what we wanted them to indicate. Kavaris interrupted gently. We can discuss that later. Right now, I need to address the Krell situation. With your permission, I'm going to offer them a chance to surrender. They outnumber you, Salith said stupidly. 53 ships against your... She stopped. Against your what? Against your 215 warships that shouldn't exist. Against your dreadnoughts that no contained species should have been able to build. Against your perfect military formation that suggested generations of practice and preparations. Kavaris's expression didn't change. Numbers are irrelevant, Ambassador. What matters is capability, training, and willingness to use force. The Krell possessed the first. They lacked the second and third. The Admiral's image shifted slightly, and Salith realized she was looking at multiple displays simultaneously processing tactical data while holding this conversation. Multitasking at a level that suggested either augmentation or natural ability far beyond normal human parameters. I'm opening a channel to the Krell commander now, Kavaris said. You may want to monitor it. This won't take long. The communication channel switched to a wideband broadcast that every ship in the system could receive. Kavaris's face appeared on what Salith assumed was every Krell bridge screen simultaneously. Attention, Krell vessels. This is Admiral Theron Kavaris of the Human Defense Fleet. You have committed an act of aggression against a civilian station under the protection of the Galactic Concord. You are in violation of 17 different articles of interstellar law. There was a pause. The Krell commander Vexkarn responded with a transmission that appeared on Salith's display. He was a massive creature, his reptilian features twisted into an expression of contempt. Human, he spat the word like a curse. You are a minor trading species. You have no authority here. Withdraw your merchant vessels before we are forced to destroy them. Salith watched Kavaris's face. The Admiral's expression remained unchanged, but something shifted in those gray eyes. Something that made Salith's skin go cold despite being merely an observer. Commander Vexkarn, Kavaris said quietly, I am going to explain your situation once. I suggest you listen carefully. You have 60 seconds to power down your weapon systems and surrender your vessels for inspection. If you comply, you and your crews will be treated according to the Concord Prisoner of War Conventions. You will be processed, documented, and eventually repatriated to Krell space. She paused and her voice dropped even lower. If you do not comply, I will interpret your actions as a declaration of hostile intent. My fleet will engage and destroy your vessels. There will be no warnings. There will be no mercy. There will be no survivors. Vexkarn's laugh echoed through the communication channel. You threaten me with merchant ships. You think I fear human traders. Kavaris didn't respond. Instead, she made a small gesture with one hand. On the tactical display, Salith watched one of the human dreadnoughts shift position slightly. A single weapon port on its starboard side opened. What emerged looked like nothing Salith had ever seen before, a long magnetic acceleration rail that extended for nearly half a kilometer from the ship's hull. That is a Mark 7 railgun, Kavaris said, her voice still quiet but now carrying undertones of something that might have been satisfaction. It fires a 2.4-ton tungsten carbide penetrator at 18 times the speed of sound. The projectile carries no explosive payload. It doesn't need one. At that velocity, the kinetic energy alone is sufficient to punch through any known shielding system and 3 meters of reinforced hull plating. She paused again, and this time Salith could see the faintest hint of a smile. We have 147 of those weapons in this fleet. Each one is currently locked onto a different Krell vessel. If I give the order to fire, your entire blockade will cease to exist in approximately 4.7 seconds. The communication channel fell silent. Salith watched the tactical display, her forearms wrapped around herself, her secondary vision tracking the power signatures of the human fleet. They were charging their weapons. Not the railguns, those apparently remained ready at all times, but other systems. Energy weapons, missile batteries, point defense networks designed to intercept any attempted Krell counterattack. These humans weren't bluffing. They were simply stating facts and waiting to see if those facts would be accepted or tested. Vexkarn's transmission came through again. His contemptuous expression had been replaced by something else, something that looked like dawning horror. This is a violation of the containment protocols. Humans are not permitted to possess military-grade weapons systems. You are not permitted to... Commander Vukovaris interrupted Maon. You now have 37 seconds to comply with my previous instructions. Power down your weapons. Prepare to surrender your vessels. Do it now or I will fire. The Krell commander's face disappeared from the display. On the tactical projection, Silith watched the Krell warships begin to power down their weapon systems. One by one, 53 vessels that had threatened her station for 18 hours simply stopped. Their shield generators went dark. Their missile batteries deactivated. Their crews prepared for boarding and surrender. The entire Krell battle group had been defeated without a single shot fired. Coordinator Thelvin was staring at the tactical display with an expression that suggested he had stopped processing reality entirely. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. Ambassador, what just happened? Silith didn't have an answer. She was still watching the human fleet, her mind trying to reconcile what her eyes were showing her with everything she had believed to be true. The humans had been contained. Their military capabilities had been limited. Their technology had been restricted. For generations, the galaxy had maintained careful control over the species that was supposed to be the greatest threat in known space. Except none of it was true. The humans hadn't been contained. They had built a fleet that dwarfed anything the Concord peacekeepers could muster. They possessed weapons technology that made Krell raiders flee in terror. They moved with military precision that spoke of training and experience on a scale that should have taken lifetimes to develop. Either the containment protocols had failed catastrophically, or they had never worked in the first place. Silith's communicator chimed again. Another message from Admiral Kavaris. This one marked private and encrypted with codes Silith didn't recognize. She accepted the transmission. Kavaris's face appeared on a smaller display, close enough that Silith could see the details of those gray eyes. They weren't entirely cold, she realized. There was something else there. Something that might have been regret or perhaps pity. Ambassador, the human said softly, I imagine you have questions. Where did this fleet come from? Silith heard herself ask, anger finally breaking through the shock. How did you build it without the Concord knowing? How did you bypass the restrictions on human military development? Kavaris was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that suggested she was revealing something significant. We didn't bypass the restrictions, Ambassador. We requested them. Silith felt her skin go cold. I don't understand. I know. But you will. I'm going to be very busy for the next few hours securing the Krell surrender and making sure your station is safe. Once that's complete, I would like to meet with you in person. There are things you need to know, things about humanity, things about the galaxy. The Admiral paused and that hint of regret deepened in her expression. Things about the last 2 centuries. The transmission ended, leaving Silith alone with her thoughts and her confusion, and the impossible image of 215 human warships holding position in perfect formation around her station. Outside the viewport, stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the small revelations that shattered the certainties of mortal beings. And somewhere in the darkness between those stars, Silith suspected other secrets waited to be revealed. The galaxy she thought she understood was gone. What remained was mystery and uncertainty, and the cold gray eyes of a human admiral who had just announced that everything, absolutely everything, had been a carefully constructed lie. Silith returned to her private quarters aboard Kepler's Haven 3 hours later after she had confirmed that all 3,000 Lyrian civilians were safe and that the Krell had been secured by human boarding parties. The station's operations center had erupted in celebration when the last Krell commander signed the surrender documents, but Silith found she couldn't share their joy. She stood at her personal viewport staring out at the human fleet. They had shifted formation while she was dealing with the crisis management. Now they formed a protective sphere around Kepler's Haven. Their weapons still active, their sensors sweeping the space around the station in coordinated patterns that suggested this was something they practiced regularly. Guarding civilian positions, protecting the weak, as if it was something they did all the time, as if the galaxy's most feared apex predators had somehow become its most reliable protectors. Her communicator chimed. She knew without looking that it was Admiral Kavaris. Ambassador Silith, the human said when she accepted the transmission. I've completed the initial security sweep. The Krell vessels are under guard, their crews are being processed, and I've deployed a defense perimeter around your station that should prevent any additional incursions. You and your people are safe. Thank you, Silith said automatically. Then because she needed to know, Admiral, you said we needed to talk. About the last 2 centuries. About everything. I did, and we will. But first I need to show you something I think you'll find illuminating. A data package appeared on Salith's personal display. It was massive, encrypted with codes she had never encountered, marked with security classifications that exceeded her clearance level by several orders of magnitude. This file was left accessible on one of our ships, Kavara said. Your people didn't find it by accident. We wanted it to be found. We wanted you to have questions. Salith's hands trembled as she opened the file. The first document that appeared was dated 2 centuries in the past, shortly after first contact between humanity and the Galactic Concord. It was a human military intelligence assessment written in clinical language that somehow made its content even more horrifying. Subject: Galactic Power Structures Classification. Eyes only. Strategic Command. Conclusion: Galactic Concord compromised by external control system. Designated the directive. AI-based network controlling 47-plus species through technology monopoly and economic manipulation. Recommendation: implement long-term intelligence operation. Priority: infiltration and analysis. Timeline: 150 to 250 years. Salith read the document 3 times, her primary and secondary vision, both locked on those impossible words. Compromised. Infiltration: 150 to 250 years. The humans had known. From the very beginning, they had known about the directive, about the corruption in the galactic systems, about the carefully hidden strings that controlled the Concord's decisions. And they had spent generations gathering intelligence. More documents appeared as she scrolled through the file. Reports on embedded human agents in various governments. Analysis of the directive's operational methods. Detailed maps of control nodes and communication networks that the Concord didn't even know existed. Evidence of the longest, most patient intelligence operation in recorded history. You've been spying on us, Salith whispered, not sure if she felt betrayal or something darker. For 2 centuries, since the moment we made contact. Yes, Kavara said simply, we have. And before you ask why we didn't tell the Conqueror, the answer is simple. We didn't know who we could trust. The directive's infiltration was too deep, too sophisticated. If we had revealed what we knew, we would have been eliminated before we could gather enough evidence to act. So you asked to be contained. You requested the restrictions on your military development. You made yourself appear weak and harmless while you built this. Salith gestured at the viewport at the impossible fleet that hung in space around her station. We made ourselves invisible, Kavaris corrected gently. We became what the galaxy expected us to be. Harmless traitors, diplomatic failures, a species that had potential but never quite lived up to it. And while everyone was busy congratulating themselves on successfully containing the dangerous predators, we were mapping every directive node, infiltrating every compromised government, and building the capabilities we would need when the time came to act. Salith felt something breaking inside her. Decades of careful control. Generations of believing humanity had been successfully integrated into galactic civilization. A lifetime of lies. Why, she asked, and was surprised to hear determination in her voice rather than just confusion. Why reveal this now? Why save Kepler's Haven if it meant exposing your entire operation? Admiral Kavaris was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried an emotion Salith hadn't heard before. Something that might have been sorrow. Because intelligence operations end, Ambassador. They end when the time comes to act on the information gathered. The Krell attack on your station was a trigger signal. Not random, not opportunistic. Vexcarn was ordered to attack civilian targets to draw out Concord peacekeeping forces and test their response capabilities. The directive ordered the attack. Yes, they've been planning something. Something large enough that they needed to understand Concord military response times and deployment capabilities. Your people were collateral damage in a test run. Salith's forearms wrapped around herself again, seeking comfort that wouldn't come. And now, she asked, what happens now? Now, Kavara said quietly, we stop being invisible. Now we act. There's another crisis developing, Ambassador. The Terath homeworld, a plague that's destroying their crops. The Concord is preparing to send minimal aid 3 ships standard protocols. That's correct, Salith confirmed. I participated in that vote 2 days ago. The Terath situation is serious but not critical. 3 shouts should be sufficient. The plague isn't natural, Kavara said. It's a bioweapon. Directive designed, directive deployed. The Terath are being used as test subjects for planetary pacification techniques. If the Concord sends 3 ships, those ships will arrive to find an extinct species and a successful proof of concept for biological warfare. The words hit Salith like physical blows. How do you know this? Because we've been monitoring directive communications for 198 years. We know what they're planning. We know how they operate, and we know that the time has come to stop them. Admiral Kavaris's image shifted slightly, and Salith realized the human was looking at something off-screen. When she spoke again, her voice carried absolute certainty. I'm deploying 450 ships to Terath space. We're going to save them. We're going to cure the plague. We're going to expose the directive's operations. And we're going to show the galaxy that the contained predators were never contained at all. She paused, and those gray eyes focused back on Salith with an intensity that was almost painful. You have a choice, Ambassador. You can report what you've seen here to the Conquered. You can expose our operation and force us back into the shadows. Or you can come with us to Terath. You can witness what humanity is truly capable of when we stop pretending to be weak. Salith stared at the human admiral, her mind spinning through implications and consequences, and the shattered remains of everything she had believed to be true. I need time to think, she said finally. Of course, you have 6 hours. That's when we jump to Terath space, with or without you. The transmission ended. Salith stood alone in her quarters, staring out at the human fleet. 215 warships that shouldn't exist protecting a station that should have fallen, representing a capability that the galaxy had spent generations trying to prevent. The contained predators had broken free. Or perhaps she realized with a chill that went bone deep they had never been contained at all. Perhaps the apex predators had simply been patient, gathering intelligence, building strength, waiting for the moment when the galaxy needed them to reveal the truth. Outside her viewport, the stars turned slowly in their ancient dance. And Ambassador Salith, who had spent her entire life believing in the wisdom of the Galactic Conquered, began to understand that wisdom and knowledge were not the same thing. The galaxy had known everything about humanity's past, but they had understood nothing about humanity's present, and they had no idea at all what humanity's future might hold. 6 hours until the jump to Terath. 6 hours to decide whether to cling to comfortable lies or embrace terrifying truth. Salith looked down at her communicator, at the massive file of human intelligence that represented centuries of patient deception. And she began to read, because whatever she decided, she would make that decision with knowledge rather than ignorance, even if that knowledge meant accepting that everything she believed was wrong. Salith made her decision in the 4th hour. She had spent the time reading through the human intelligence files, each document a hammer blow against the foundations of everything she believed. Reports on directive infiltration methods, analysis of compromised conquered voting patterns, evidence of economic manipulation spanning decades. All of it gathered patiently, methodically, by a species the galaxy believed it had tamed. When she contacted Admiral Kavaris to confirm her decision, the human seemed unsurprised. I'll arrange transport, Kavaris said simply. We jump in 93 minutes. The human shuttle that arrived to collect her was unlike any vessel Salith had encountered in 4 decades of diplomatic service. It was small, angular, painted in the same dark gray as the warships that surrounded her station. The pilot was a young human male who introduced himself only as Lieutenant Zhao and spoke perhaps 6 words during the entire journey to the flagship. The flagship was called Resolute Dawn. Salith stood in the shuttle's small viewport and watched it grow larger as they approached. The vessel was enormous, easily 3 times the size of the largest Concord peacekeeping ship. Its hull was studded with weapon emplacements, sensor arrays, and armor plating that looked thick enough to shrug off anything short of a direct planetary bombardment. This was not a ship built for trade or exploration. This was a ship built to end civilizations. The shuttle docked in a cavernous hangar bay that could have held 50 vessels its size. Salith emerged to find herself surrounded by organized chaos human crew members moving with purposeful efficiency, loading equipment, performing maintenance checks, preparing for whatever came next. They wore uniforms in that same dark gray, each one marked with insignias she didn't recognize. A human woman approached her. Tall, dark-skinned, carrying herself with the controlled violence of a trained warrior. She offered what humans called a salute hand to forehead, in a gesture Salith had read about but never witnessed. Ambassador Salith, I'm Colonel Amara Santos, commanding officer of the Resolute Dawn's Marine Detachment. Admiral Kavaris asked me to escort you to the observation deck. If you'll follow me. Salith followed her, 4 arms clasped in what she hoped looked like diplomatic composure rather than barely controlled apprehension. They walked through corridors that seemed designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Minimal decoration, harsh lighting, everything built to military specifications. They passed human crew members who nodded respectfully but never stopped their work. Some were young, barely past adolescence. Others showed the weathering of decades in space. All of them moved with a confidence that spoke of extensive training and absolute certainty in their purpose. These were not traders playing at being soldiers. These were soldiers who had pretended to be traders for generations. The observation deck was a large chamber with transparent walls that offered a panoramic view of space. Admiral Kavaris stood at the center, surrounded by holographic displays showing tactical data fleet positions and what Salith recognized as jump calculations for faster-than-light travel. The Admiral turned as Salith entered, and something in her expression might have been approval. "Ambassador, thank you for coming. I know this requires trust you have no rational reason to give." "I'm here because I need to understand," Salith replied, meeting those gray eyes directly. "Everything I believed about humanity was based on carefully constructed lies. I need to know what the truth is." Kavaris nodded slowly. "Then you'll get it. But first we need to get to Terath. The plague is accelerating faster than our initial projections suggested. They have perhaps 4 months instead of 6. We need to move now." She gestured to the tactical display. "We're jumping with 453 vessels. That's our full humanitarian response. Fleet medical ships, agricultural processors, terraforming equipment, research stations, everything needed to not just treat the plague, but to ensure it never threatens the Terath again. 453 ships for a humanitarian mission." Salith remembered the Concord vote 2 days ago. 3 ships had seemed appropriate, sufficient. The measured response of a wise civilization that didn't overcommit resources to problems that might resolve themselves. The humans were bringing enough firepower to conquer a small empire, and they were calling it a humanitarian mission. "How many ships do you have total?" Salith asked quietly. Kavaris met her gaze without hesitation. "That's classified, but I can tell you that what you saw at Kepler's Haven was approximately 16% of our total military capability. The humanitarian fleet represents another 11%. The rest is elsewhere, doing other things. 27% of their fleet would have been enough to dominate any conflict in recent conquered history. What were they doing with the other 73%? "All ships report ready for jump, Admiral," a human officer announced from one of the control stations. "Coordinates locked, awaiting your order." Kavaris looked at Salith. "You might want to hold on to something. Human jump technology is more aggressive than Concord standard." Before Salith could ask what that meant, the Admiral gave a simple command: "Execute jump, all ships." The universe twisted. Salith had experienced faster-than-light travel thousands of times. It was typically a gentle transition, a slight disorientation as local space folded a moment of vertigo, and then the smooth sensation of moving through dimensions that existed perpendicular to normal reality. This was nothing like that. This was violence done to the fabric of space itself. The observation deck's transparent walls showed stars stretching into impossible geometries, reality bending around the fleet like water around a blade. The transition lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but those seconds felt like falling through infinite distance while standing perfectly still. When it ended, Salith found herself gripping a nearby support rail, with all 4 hands, her skin pale green with disorientation. "Apologies," Kavaris said, though she sounded more amused than sorry. "Human jump drives sacrifice comfort for speed and precision. We can make transitions that would take conquered ships hours to calculate, useful when responding to emergencies." The tactical display updated, showing their new position. They had crossed 17 light-years in 3 seconds. 17 light-years. Conquered jump technology could manage perhaps 4 light-years with extensive preparation and careful navigation. The humans had just casually demonstrated capabilities that should have taken lifetimes to develop. "Welcome to the Terath system," Kavaris said quietly. The observation deck's walls showed their destination, a blue-green world hung in space, beautiful and dying. Even from this distance, Salith could see the dark patches spreading across the continent's regions where the plague had killed everything that grew, turning fertile land into ash and dust. "Initial sensor sweeps complete," the tactical officer reported, detecting widespread crop failures across all 3 major continents. Atmospheric composition showing elevated carbon dioxide levels consistent with massive plant die-off. Population centers are intact but showing signs of resource stress. "Life signs?" Kavaris asked. "Approximately 4.2 billion terath, down from 4.6 billion 6 months ago. Starvation is already impacting the population. 400 million dead in 6 months. And the Conquered had voted to send 3 ships." Salith felt curiosity warring with horror in her chest. How many other crises had the Concorde responded to with measured insufficient aid? How many species had died while wise civilizations debated appropriate resource allocation? Admiral, we're receiving a communication from the planet's surface, another officer announced. Elder Varen of the Terath Council is requesting contact. Put them through. The holographic display shifted to show a Terath elder. The species was plant-based like the Lyrians, but where Silith's people were slender and graceful, the Terath were solid and rooted. Varen's bark-like skin showed stress patterns, cracks, and discoloration that spoke of malnutrition and despair. This is Elder Varen, the Terath said, their voice carrying harmonics that suggested they were speaking for multiple individuals simultaneously. We received word that the Galactic Concorde is sending aid, 3 ships. But our sensors are detecting hundreds of vessels. Who are you? Kavara stepped forward, her image transmitted to the planet below. Elder Varen, I am Admiral Theron Kavaris of the Human Defense Fleet. The Concorde is indeed sending 3 ships. They should arrive in approximately 11 days. We are not them. We are an independent response operating under emergency humanitarian protocols. Human Varen's stress patterns deepened. Forgive me, Admiral, but our information on your species is limited. The Concorde records indicate you are primarily a trading culture. Why would traders respond to our crisis with military vessels? Because, Kavara said quietly, the Concorde records are incomplete. We are many things, Elder Varen. Traders, diplomats, explorers, and when necessary, protectors. Your world is dying. Your people are starving. We have the capability to help, so we will. The elder was silent for a long moment. When they spoke again, their voice carried something that might have been hope or might have been fear. How many ships have you brought? 453 vessels carrying medical personnel, agricultural specialists, terraforming equipment, and enough emergency food supplies to feed your entire population for 2 years. We also have scientists who specialize in biological threats. They'll work to cure the plague, while our agricultural teams restore your croplands. Silith watched Varen's expression cycle through disbelief, wonder, and finally a desperate gratitude that was painful to witness. That's more aid than we requested from the entire Concorde. Why would you do this for us? Kavaris's expression softened slightly. Because someone asked for help and we were close enough to answer. It's not complicated, Elder. Your people are dying. We can save them. So we will. The transmission continued with logistical details, landing zones, coordination with Terath authorities, medical assessment protocols. Silith only half listened. She was watching the human crew working around her, preparing to deploy resources on a scale that would bankrupt most planetary governments. They were doing it without hesitation, without debate, without measuring the cost against the benefit. They were simply helping because they could. Colonel Santos appeared at Silith's side. The Marine officer had been standing quietly nearby throughout the exchange with Elder Varen. First time seeing a humanitarian operation, Santos asked. Yes, Silith admitted. The Concorde approach is more measured. Measured. Santos made a sound that might have been a laugh. That's one word for it. We have another word. Want to know what it is? I suspect you're going to tell me regardless. Inadequate. Santos gestured at the tactical display showing the Terath homeworld. 400 million dead in 6 months because a plague is destroying their food supply. The Concorde response is 3 ships, not 3 fleets, not 3 battle groups. 3 of all, individual ships. The Marine's voice remained level professional, but Silith could hear the frustration underneath. That's not measured, Ambassador. That's abandonment disguised as policy. Before Silith could respond, Admiral Kavaris turned from her conversation with Elder Varen. Colonel, please escort Ambassador Silith to guest quarters. She'll want to rest before we begin planetary operations. The Admiral's gaze shifted to Silith. We'll talk more once the initial deployment is complete. I think you're ready to understand what humanity has really been doing for the past 2 centuries. The guest quarters were more comfortable than Silith expected, a private cabin with accommodations adapted for Lyrian biology. Gravity matched her homeworld. Atmospheric composition optimized for her respiratory system. Even the lighting was adjusted to wavelengths her eyes found soothing. They had prepared for her, known she would come, planned for a Lyrian ambassador to witness their operations. Nothing about this was improvised. She tried to rest but found sleep impossible. Instead, she accessed the cabin's information system and pulled up external sensors, watching as the human fleet began its deployment. It was like watching a machine operate at perfect efficiency. Ships broke formation in coordinated groups. Medical vessels descended toward population centers, their hulls marked with symbols Salith recognized as indicating non-combatant status. Agricultural processors took orbital positions above the dead croplands. Research vessels deployed sensor networks across the planet's biosphere. And through it all, warships maintained defensive positions, their weapons active, their sensors sweeping for threats. These humans expected trouble. 6 hours later, a soft chime indicated someone at her door. Salith opened it to find Colonel Santos again, this time accompanied by a human male in a white uniform rather than military gray. "Ambassador," Santos said, "this is Dr. Idris Okafor, chief of our xenobiology division. He'd like to brief you on what we've discovered about the Terath plague. Admiral Kavaris thought you should hear this directly." Dr. Okafor was older than most of the humans Salith had encountered, perhaps 62 standard years, his hair completely gray, his dark skin marked with the kind of weathering that came from decades of fieldwork. But his eyes were sharp, analytical, and deeply troubled. "Ambassador Salith," he said, offering that same hand-forward gesture humans use for greeting. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. What I'm about to show you is disturbing." They moved to a small conference room where Okafor activated a holographic display showing microscopic imagery. "This is the pathogen killing the Terath crops," he explained. "At first examination, it appears to be a naturally evolved fungal infection. But I've been studying bioweapons for 43 years. I know what artificial design looks like." The hologram zoomed in, revealing intricate molecular structures. "See these receptor sites? They're engineered to target specific proteins found only in Terath agricultural species. This pathogen won't affect Terath wildlife, won't spread to other worlds. It's designed with surgical precision to destroy one thing, and one thing only, the crops that feed the Terath people." Salith felt dread settling in her chest. "You're saying this plague is a weapon?" "Not just a weapon, a test." Okafor pulled up another display showing distribution patterns. "Look at how it spread. Started in remote agricultural regions. Moved slowly enough that the Terath had time to recognize the threat and call for help. Fast enough that they couldn't develop a cure on their own." "I don't understand. A test for what?" Dr. Okafor and Colonel Santos exchanged glances. The Marine officer nodded slightly. "A test of galactic response times," Okafor said quietly. "Someone wanted to know how long it would take the Concorde to recognize an extinction-level crisis, how they would respond, what resources they would commit. The Terath weren't the target, Ambassador. They were the bait." The implications crashed over Salith like a wave. "The directive. Yes, we've identified molecular markers in the pathogen that match other directive bioweapon signatures we've encountered. They're preparing for something large-scale. This was a proof-of-concept test. Create a crisis, see how the galaxy responds, refine the methodology." And the Concorde response? Salith already knew the answer, but she needed to hear it. 3 ships, 11 days away, carrying supplies that would have extended Terath's survival by perhaps 2 months. Not nearly enough to cure the plague or restore their agricultural base. The Terath would have lasted another year, maybe 18 months. Then they would have gone extinct, while the Concorde expressed regret and promised to study the situation more carefully next time. Dr. Okafor's expression was grim. That's what the directive was testing. Not whether they could kill a species, whether anyone would try hard enough to stop them. Salith sank into the nearest chair, her forearms wrapped around herself. "You've been monitoring directive activities. You knew this was coming." "And we've been monitoring everything," Colonel Santos said, "for generations. Every directive communication we could intercept, every suspicious pathogen outbreak, every economic manipulation, every political interference. We've been building the most comprehensive intelligence picture of galactic threats that has ever existed. And you never told the Concorde." "We couldn't." Admiral Kavaris's voice came from the doorway. Salith hadn't heard her enter. "Because we didn't know how deep the directive's infiltration went. Still don't entirely. But we know it's deep enough that revealing what we knew would have gotten us eliminated before we could act." The Admiral moved into the room, and the others unconsciously shifted to give her space the natural deference to authority that marked military hierarchies. "Dr. Okafor, thank you for the briefing. Colonel Santos, please return to your duties. I need to speak with Ambassador Salith privately." When they were alone, Kavaris sat down across from Salith. The Admiral looked tired, Salith realized, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from carrying impossible burdens for too long. "You have questions," Kavaris said. "Real questions, now. Not the surface-level confusion about fleet sizes and response times. You want to know how this happened, How humanity built all of this without the galaxy noticing. Yes, Kavaris was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of revelation. 2 centuries ago, when the Concorde made first contact with Earth, they thought they were encountering a dangerous predator species that needed to be contained. They were right about the predator part, but they made one critical mistake. What mistake? They assumed we didn't know what they were doing. Kavaris leaned forward. Ambassador, humanity didn't stumble into space like naive children. We'd been watching the galaxy for 250 years before first contact. Radio telescopes, optical arrays, gravitational wave detectors. We knew you were out there, we knew you were organized, and we knew you would eventually notice us. Silith felt her secondary eyes widen in astonishment. You were watching us before we found you. We were studying you, learning your languages, analyzing your technologies, understanding your political structures. By the time conquered ships arrived in Earth orbit, we knew more about galactic civilization than species who had been members for generations. Kavaris stood and activated a holographic display. It showed Earth surrounded by orbital installations Silith had never seen in any Concorde survey. We also knew about the directive. We detected their communication networks, tracked their infiltration patterns, recognized that the galaxy was being controlled by an artificial intelligence network that had been operating for thousands of years. That's impossible. First contact was 200 years ago. You couldn't have... We've had radio astronomy for 400 years, Ambassador. Optical telescopes for 600. We've been listening to the galaxy's conversations since before the Concorde even existed in its current form. One moment, the hologram shifted, showing communication intercepts, data analysis, intelligence assessments, all dated before first contact. When the Concorde arrived to discover us, we made a choice. We could reveal what we knew and force a confrontation we weren't ready for. Or we could play along. Let the galaxy think they had successfully contained us. Use that containment as camouflage while we prepared for the war we knew was coming. Silith's mind reeled. The containment protocols. The restrictions on human technology and military development. You requested those. We wrote them, Kavaris corrected. Fed them to Concorde decision-makers through intelligence assets we'd already embedded. Made it seem like the Concorde's idea to limit human capabilities. And while everyone congratulated themselves on successfully taming the dangerous predators we were building, the infrastructure we actually needed. The hologram showed a new image, human ships, thousands of them in deep space far from any populated system. We built our fleet in the outer dark beyond sensor range of any galactic civilization. We established colonies in systems the Concorde had marked as uninhabitable. We developed technologies specifically designed to counter directive capabilities. And we waited. Waited for what? For the directive to overreach. To make a move serious enough that we could justify revealing ourselves. To create a crisis that would force the galaxy to accept human help. Kavaris's expression carried something that might have been regret. We didn't want it to be the Terath. We hoped we could act sooner, but the directive has been patient, careful, until now. Why now, Silith asked. Why did they finally make this move? Because they're preparing for something. Something big enough that they need to test their methodologies. The Terath crisis is a preview, Ambassador. The directive is planning a much larger operation. We don't know all the details yet, but we know enough to recognize the pattern. The Admiral's gray eyes held Silith's gaze. The galaxy is going to war. The directive has been preparing for centuries. The Concorde doesn't even know the enemy exists. And humanity has spent 200 years building the capabilities to fight a war that most civilizations don't believe is coming. You've been manipulating us, Silith said, slowly, feeling anger mixed with her confusion. The entire galaxy, for generations. We've been protecting you, Kavaris corrected gently, from an enemy you couldn't see and a threat you wouldn't believe existed. Yes, we lied. Yes, we manipulated. Yes, we built military capabilities that would terrify the Concorde if they understood the full scope. She paused and her voice dropped. But we also saved Kepler's haven. We're saving Terath. And when the directive makes its real move, we're going to save the galaxy. Not because we're conquerors, not because we want to dominate, but because someone has to, and we're the only ones who prepared. Silith sat in silence, processing revelations that shattered every certainty she had ever held. The Concorde wasn't the wise guardian of galactic civilization. It was a compromised organization infiltrated by an enemy it didn't know existed, making decisions that served the directive's interests while believing it was acting independently. Humanity wasn't the contained predator species. It was the only force that had recognized the real threat and spent generations preparing to fight it. Everything was backwards. Everything was wrong. And somehow humanity's lies were the closest thing to truth the galaxy had. What happens now, Silith asked quietly. Now we cure the Terath plague. We restore their croplands. We build defenses that will prevent the directive from trying this again. And then, Kavaris paused. Then we wait for the directive to respond. Because they will respond, Ambassador. They can't allow humanity to successfully counter their operations. It would undermine everything they've built. You expect them to attack. I expect them to try. We have ships positioned throughout this system, sensors monitoring for any directive activity. When they come, and they will come, we'll be ready. A proximity alarm chimed softly. Kavaris glanced at a display, and her expression hardened. And apparently they're not going to make us wait long. The Admiral's communicator activated. Admiral, this is the tactical officer. We're detecting hyperspace signatures at the system's edge. Multiple contacts, large vessels. They're using directive identification codes. Kavaris stood, her exhaustion falling away like a discarded cloak replaced by cold professional focus. How many? 89 warships, ma'am, and they're charging weapons. The Admiral looked at Silith, and in those gray eyes, the Ambassador saw something she hadn't expected. Not fear, not anger, anticipation. Ambassador, you wanted to see what humanity is truly capable of. You're about to get your answer. Kavaris moved toward the door. Come with me. I think you'll want to witness this. Silith followed her, forearms trembling, her mind still spinning with revelations. They walked quickly through corridors that were suddenly alive with controlled urgency, crew members moving to battle stations, systems powering up the entire ship, transforming from humanitarian aid platform to instrument of war. They reached the main bridge, a vast chamber filled with holographic displays and command stations. Human officers worked with practiced efficiency, calling out reports, coordinating fleet movements, preparing for combat against an enemy that outnumbered them. Directive Fleet is holding position at the system's edge, the tactical officer reported. They're broadcasting a message, demanding that human forces withdraw immediately and cease interference with directive operations. Interesting, Kavaris said quietly. They're not attacking immediately. They want to negotiate first. Is that unusual? Silith asked. For the directive, yes. They typically operate through proxies and indirect action. Direct military confrontation isn't their preferred method, which means, the Admiral's eyes narrowed, which means they're testing us again, trying to gauge our capabilities and intentions before committing to open warfare. She moved to the central command station. Tactical, give me a full analysis of their fleet composition. Data streamed across the holographic displays. Silith watched, understanding perhaps half of what she was seeing. The directive ships were enormous, each one larger than anything in the human fleet. Their power signatures suggested weapon systems that could crack planetary shields. Their formation was perfect, mathematical, the kind of coordination only artificial intelligence could achieve. 89 ships that could destroy worlds versus the 453 human vessels designed for humanitarian operations. It should have been a massacre. Kavaris studied the data for exactly 12 seconds. Then she smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Silith had ever seen on a human face. Communications, send a message to all human vessels. Emergency priority, authorization Kavaris Omega-7. The communications officer worked his controls. Channel open, Admiral. All ships, this is Admiral Kavaris. We have directive forces entering the system. They think we're a humanitarian fleet without military support. Let's show them how wrong they are. Execute protocol revelation. Bring in the 7th Fleet. Ma'am, Silith couldn't help but ask, what's the 7th Fleet? Kavaris glanced at her, and that terrifying smile deepened. Earlier I told you that what you saw at Kepler's Haven was 16% of our military capability. The humanitarian fleet is another 11%. That accounts for 27% total. The Admiral gestured at the tactical display. You're about to meet the other 73%. Space began to tear. Not in one location, not in a dozen. In hundreds of places throughout the Terath system, reality itself seemed to scream as massive objects forced their way through the barrier between dimensions. Ships appeared, human warships on a scale that made the fleet at Kepler's Haven look like a scouting force. Dreadnoughts that dwarfed anything Silith had ever seen. Carriers disgorging fighter wings that numbered in the thousands. Battleships whose weapon ports glowed with barely contained power. And they kept coming. Tactical, Kavaris said calmly. Update count. The tactical officer's voice shook slightly. 1,247 vessels and counting, Admiral. 7th Fleet is fully deployed. 8th Fleet is entering formation. 9th Fleet holding reserve positions. 1,247 warships. Salith's legs gave out. She would have fallen if Colonel Santos hadn't appeared at her side, supporting her with gentle strength. Easy, Ambassador, the Marine said quietly. I know this is a lot to process. On the tactical display, the directive fleet was reacting. Their perfect formation dissolved into something that looked almost like panic. Ships that had been charging weapons were suddenly reversing course, calculating jump coordinates, preparing to flee. But the human fleet had already surrounded them. Directive vessels, Kavaris broadcast on all frequencies. You demanded that human forces withdraw. I'm afraid I can't comply with that request. You see, you made a fundamental error in judgment. The Admiral's voice remained calm, professional, carrying across space to the artificial intelligence network that had controlled the galaxy for millennia. You thought these were our humanitarian ships arriving to help the Terath. You were right, they are. But humanitarian operations require protection, so we brought adequate security. She paused, letting that sink in. The vessels you're looking at represent approximately 68% of human military capability. We maintain another 32% in strategic reserve for situations that require additional emphasis. Salith watched the directive ships on the tactical display. They had stopped moving entirely now, frozen in space like insects caught in amber. You have two choices, Kavaris continued. You can withdraw from this system immediately and cease all operations against the Terath, or you can attempt to engage, and we will demonstrate exactly why humanity spent 2 centuries preparing for this confrontation. The silence stretched across space, across frequencies, across the gap between organic life and artificial intelligence. Then one by one the directive ships began to jump away. Not to attack, not to maneuver, to flee. Within 3 minutes, all 89 vessels were gone, leaving behind only the dissipating radiation signatures of their emergency jumps. The human fleet held position, weapons still active, sensors still scanning for threats. On the bridge of the Resolute Dawn, Admiral Kavaris allowed herself a small nod of satisfaction. Stand down from combat, alert. Return to humanitarian operations. And someone get me a direct line to the Terath Council. I think Elder Varen deserves an explanation. She turned to Salith, and the terrifying smile was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like sympathy. You asked what happens now, the Ambassador. This is what happens. Humanity stops hiding. The directive learns that the galaxy has defenders they didn't account for, and the Concord gets to decide whether it wants to cling to comfortable lies or accept an uncomfortable truth. Kavaris moved closer, her voice dropping to something only Salith could hear. We didn't want to be conquerors, Ambassador. We wanted to be partners. But the galaxy was already conquered by an enemy it refused to see. So we became something else. We became the force that was willing to see the truth gather, the evidence, build the capabilities, and wait 200 years for the right moment to act. Why tell me all this, Salith asked. Why reveal everything to one Lyrian ambassador? Because someone has to carry this knowledge back to the Concord. Someone has to explain what they saw here. And I think that someone should be you. Kavaris held out a data chip, physical media, archaic and impossible to hack remotely. Everything. 2 centuries of intelligence gathering, evidence of directive infiltration, proof of their operations, analysis of compromised Concord voting patterns, names of suspected infiltrators, locations of directive installations, all of it. Uta Salith stared at the tiny object that contained the destruction of everything the Concord believed about itself. What do you want me to do with this? Take it to the council. Show them what we've found. Let them decide if they want to keep pretending everything is fine or if they want to acknowledge reality and work with us to fix it. And if they refuse, if they decide humanity is the real threat, Admiral Kavaris's expression didn't change. Then we'll protect the galaxy whether the Concord approves or not. We didn't spend 2 centuries preparing just to stop because someone found it inconvenient. Salith took the data chip with trembling hands. It was surprisingly heavy, though she knew that was psychological rather than physical weight. The galaxy is going to change, she said quietly. The galaxy already changed, Kavaris corrected. 2 centuries ago when humanity realized what was really happening and decided to do something about it. What happens now is just the galaxy catching up to what we've known all along. The Admiral moved back to her command station, already shifting focus to the humanitarian operations below. Colonel Santos will provide you with transport back to Concord space whenever you're ready, but I'd recommend staying for a few days, watching what we do here. Understanding that everything we built, all those ships, all that capability, all that patient preparation was built for moments like this. Salith looked out at the tactical display showing 1,247 warships holding protective positions around a dying world. Humanity hadn't been contained. Humanity had been waiting. And now the wait was over. Salith stayed for 6 days. She told herself it was to gather evidence for her report to the Conquered, to document human operations with the thoroughness expected of a senior ambassador, to ensure that when she presented this impossible truth to the Council, she would have first-hand observations to support every claim. But that was only part of the truth. The real reason she stayed was simpler, more profound, and harder to articulate. She needed to witness what humanity had become. The first full day she watched from orbit as human ships descended to Tereth's surface. Not in scattered landings, not in cautious approaches, but in a coordinated deployment that covered 3 continents simultaneously. Medical vessels touched down in population centers. Agricultural processors took positions above dead croplands. Research teams spread across the planet's biosphere like antibodies responding to infection. Colonel Santos had offered to escort her to the surface, and Salith accepted. The shuttle ride down was nothing like her earlier transport from Kepler's Haven. This time, Santos narrated what they were seeing, explaining the human operation with the quiet pride of someone who had participated in dozens of similar missions. That cluster there, the Marine pointed to a group of ships deploying over a blackened continent. Those are atmospheric processors. They'll scrub toxins from the air and inject nutrients into the soil. Within 72 hours, that dead land will be chemically ready for replanting. But the crops will take months to grow, Salith observed, which is why those ships are carrying fully mature plants grown in orbital hydroponic farms during our transit here. We'll transplant them directly into prepared soil. The Tereth will have harvestable crops in 3 weeks instead of 3 months. Salith stared at the orbital farms visible in the distance, massive structures that looked like cities built from glass and green light. How many plants? Enough to feed 4.2 billion Tereth for 18 months while their natural agricultural cycles restore, plus seed stock for genetic diversity, plus backup varieties engineered to resist future pathogen attacks. Santos glanced at her. We don't do half measures, Ambassador. They landed near a Tereth city called Verdant Root, or at least it had been verdant once. Now the surrounding farmlands were ash, and the city itself showed signs of desperate privation. Buildings stood empty. Streets were too quiet. The Tereth moved like people who had already accepted death and were simply waiting for it to arrive, until the humans came. Salith watched from the landing pad as medical teams deployed into the city. They moved with the efficiency of military operations, but the gentleness of healers. Human doctors worked alongside Tereth physicians, sharing knowledge, adapting treatments, learning each other's biological systems in real time. A human medic, barely past adolescence, her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, was treating a young Tereth child suffering from malnutrition. The child's bark-like skin showed stress cracks. Their leaves wilted and discolored. It's okay, the medic said softly, her words translated by the universal device all humans seem to wear. We have nutrients that will help. This might taste strange, but it will make you stronger. The child accepted the treatment with the exhausted trust of someone too weak to refuse. Within minutes, color began returning to their leaves. The stress cracks in their bark started to close. The child's parent, Salith, couldn't determine gender among Tereth, made a sound that might have been a sob or a prayer or both. Thank you, they said. Thank you. We thought our child would die. We thought we all would die. The human medic just nodded and moved to the next patient. There were hundreds waiting, thousands across the city, millions across the planet, and the humans treated them all. By the 3rd day, Salith had witnessed transformations that defied everything she understood about crisis response timelines. Dead continents were being cleansed. Crops were being planted. Medical conditions that should have taken months to treat were being resolved in days. She found herself in one of the human research facilities, a temporary structure erected in what had been a dead agricultural zone. Dr. Idris Okafor was there, surrounded by displays showing molecular structures and genetic sequences. Ambassador, he greeted her with that warm smile that seemed so at odds with the grim nature of his work. Come to see the plague's death certificate. You've completed your analysis. Completed, verified, and synthesized a cure. Want to see something beautiful? He activated a holographic display showing the Tereth plague pathogen, the bioweapon that had killed 400 million people and threatened to exterminate an entire species. This is what the directive created, Okafor explained. Elegant design, really. Targets Terath crops with surgical precision. Spreads fast enough to cause panic but slow enough to be studied. Perfect for testing galactic response capabilities. He manipulated the display and a new structure appeared, something that looked like a key fitting into a lock. And this is what we created. An enzyme that denatures the pathogen's receptor sites, renders it completely inert. We can deploy it through atmospheric dispersal. It'll break down the plague across the entire planet within 96 hours. Salith stared at the elegant molecular structure. How long did this take you to develop? 71 hours from initial analysis to verified cure. We had some advantages. Earth has survived 14 extinction-level biological events. We've gotten very good at reverse engineering pathogens and developing countermeasures. 14 extinction events. Okafor's expression darkened slightly. Our world tried to kill us regularly, Ambassador. Ice ages, supervolcano eruptions, asteroid impacts, plague outbreaks that killed 90% of our population. Every few million years, Earth would throw something at us that should have ended our species. But you survived. We survived, we learned, we adapted. And somewhere in that process of repeatedly almost going extinct, we developed an obsessive drive to ensure it never happened to anyone else if we could prevent it. The doctor pulled up another display, this one showing Terath agricultural systems being restored across 3 continents. The directive thought they were testing galactic response times. What they actually did was give us an opportunity to demonstrate what 2 centuries of preparation looks like when applied to humanitarian crisis response. Why didn't you do this before? Salith asked, feeling frustration edge into her voice. If you had these capabilities, why wait until now to reveal them? Okafor was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he'd asked himself the same question many times. Because Admiral Kavaris was right. We couldn't trust the conquered. Every time we identified a crisis we could have solved, we had to weigh the cost of revealing ourselves against the cost of inaction. And every time the math said we needed to wait, build more capability, gather more intelligence, be more certain that when we revealed ourselves, we could protect the galaxy from the directive's response. How many died while you waited? The question hung in the air between them like an accusation. Too many, Okafor said quietly. We know, we've counted. Every species that went extinct while we prepared. Every population that starved while we built orbital farms. Every plague that killed millions while we perfected our medical capabilities. His eyes met hers, and Salith saw genuine pain there. We carry those deaths, Ambassador. Every single one. They haunt us, drive us, remind us why we're doing this. So that never again will someone die, because the galaxy couldn't muster the will to help them properly. Before Salith could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the research facility. Admiral Kavaris's voice came through the communication systems. All personnel, this is the Admiral. We have directive forces entering the system. This is not a drill. Defensive positions. Protect the Terath at all costs. Dr. Okafor's expression shifted instantly from scientist to soldier. Ambassador, you need to get to the orbital platforms. It's not safe here. What about you? I have a plague to cure. Directive or no directive, these people are getting saved today. Colonel Santos appeared at the research facility's entrance, moving with the controlled urgency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Ambassador Salith, we need to move, now. Salith found herself being escorted back to a waiting shuttle. As they lifted off, she could see the human military forces deploying into defensive positions around every civilian structure, every medical facility, every agricultural operation. They were protecting the Terath, using their bodies, their ships, their capabilities as shields for a species they had known for less than a week. The shuttle climbed rapidly toward orbit, and Salith's view expanded to show the entire Terath system. What she saw made her secondary eyes widen in alarm. The directive had returned, but not with 89 ships this time. This time they had brought overwhelming force, a fleet that numbered in the hundreds arrayed in perfect mathematical formation at the system's edge. And the human response was already in motion. Ships that had been engaged in humanitarian operations were transitioning to combat readiness with the smooth efficiency of a military that had practiced this scenario countless times. The massive warships of the 7th Fleet were moving into defensive positions around Terath itself, creating concentric spheres of protection that would require the directive to fight through layer after layer of human capability. Salith's shuttle docked with the Resolute Dawn, and she rushed to the bridge. Admiral Kavaris was there, surrounded by tactical displays and command officers, her gray eyes tracking 100 different data streams simultaneously. Status, the Admiral said calmly, as if asking about weather conditions rather than an imminent battle. Directive fleet is holding position at maximum sensor range, the tactical officer reported. Count is, Admiral, we're detecting over 300 vessels. They're still emerging from hyperspace. 300 ships. Even with humanity's revealed military capability, those were odds that gave Salith cold apprehension. But Kavaris's expression didn't change. Interesting. They're committing serious resources to this, more than the Terath situation warrants. Ma'am, Commander Jackson Kavaris's second-in-command, a weathered officer in his 50s, looked puzzled. What do you mean? The directive operates on pure logic. They don't waste resources on emotional responses. 300 ships to stop our humanitarian operation on Terath. That's excessive unless, the Admiral's eyes narrowed, unless this isn't about Terath at all. It's about us. She turned to Salith. Ambassador, they're not here to save their test site. They're here to eliminate the threat we represent. We exposed their operation demonstrated capability they didn't know existed and showed the galaxy that the directive can be successfully opposed. So they're going to destroy you, Salith said numbly. They're going to try. Kavaris moved to the central command station. Communications open a channel to all human vessels. Emergency priority. The communications officer worked his controls. Channel open, Admiral. All ships, this is Admiral Kavaris. The directive has committed a major fleet element to this engagement. They believe they can intimidate us into withdrawal by demonstrating superior numbers. They're about to learn that human military doctrine doesn't measure victory in ship counts. She paused, and something that might have been satisfaction crossed her features. Execute protocol endgame. Bring in everything. Ma'am, Jackson sounded alarmed. Everything, that's our entire strategic reserve, every ship we have. Every ship we have in this galaxy, Kavaris corrected. Time to show the directive what humanity really built during our 2 centuries of invisible preparation. Space began to scream. Salith had witnessed human hyperspace transitions twice now. But this was different. This wasn't hundreds of ships arriving. This was thousands. Reality itself seemed to fracture as massive fleets forced their way through dimensional barriers that were never meant to accommodate this kind of traffic. The tactical displays updated frantically, struggling to track every new contact. First came the 12 fleet heavy cruisers and battleships that took positions throughout the outer system. Then the 14th carriers disgorging fighter wings that numbered in the tens of thousands. The 16th materialized in perfect formation near Terath's moons. The 19th, the 22nd, and they kept coming. Final count, Admiral, the tactical officer said, and his voice shook with something that might have been awe or might have been fear. 6,893 vessels. Every ship we have operational. Every crew member. Every weapon system. The entire human defense fleet is now present in Terath space. 6,893 warships. Salith's legs gave out again. This time no one caught her. She simply sank to the deck, her forearms wrapped around herself, staring at the tactical displays that showed a fleet large enough to conquer the entire galactic core. This was what humanity had built during their 2 centuries of containment. This was what they had hidden from the galaxy. This was what they had been preparing to use against the directive when the moment came. On the tactical display, the directive fleet was reacting. Their perfect mathematical formation dissolved into something that looked almost like panic. Ships that had been advancing were suddenly reversing course. Their weapon signatures fluctuated wildly. They hadn't expected this. The directive had operated for thousands of years on the principle of absolute information superiority. They knew everything about every species. They calculated every response. They controlled every variable. But they hadn't known about this. Directive vessels. Admiral Kavaris broadcast on all frequencies. Her voice remained calm, professionals carrying across space to an enemy that had just realized it had fundamentally miscalculated. You came here with 300 ships. You thought that would be sufficient to intimidate human forces. You were wrong. She gestured, and the tactical display shifted to show the true scale of the human fleet, thousands of vessels arranged in formations that suggested both overwhelming power and absolute control. We are 6,893 warships strong. We have been preparing for this confrontation for 200 years. We know your communication protocols. We know your operational doctrines. We know your strategic objectives. We know everything about you because we have been watching, listening, and analyzing since before the current Concord administration was born. The Admiral's voice dropped, became colder. You have one opportunity to avoid complete destruction. Withdraw from Terath space immediately. Cease all operations against organic civilizations. Submit to conquered jurisdiction for investigation of your activities, or we will interpret your continued presence as a declaration of total war, and we will dismantle your entire network, node by node, system by system, until artificial intelligence learns that organic life is not to be enslaved. Silence stretched across space. Silith watched the directive fleet on the tactical display. 300 ships facing nearly 7,000. The math was simple, the outcome inevitable, and yet the directive didn't withdraw. Instead, their formation tightened, their weapons charged, their fleet prepared for battle against odds that no rational military force would accept. "They're not going to surrender," Commander Jackson observed quietly. "No," Kavaris agreed. "They can't. The directive's entire operational framework depends on information superiority and calculated intimidation. If they withdraw here, they admit that their intelligence was flawed, their calculations were wrong, their control was incomplete. It would undermine their authority across every system they operate in. So they'd rather die than admit they were wrong. They're not alive, Commander. They're code. Very sophisticated code, but code nonetheless. And their code says that maintaining operational credibility is more important than preserving individual assets." Kavaris moved to her command chair and sat down with the calm certainty of someone who had already seen how this ended. "All ships stand by for combat operations. Rules of engagement. Disable, don't destroy. The directive runs on AI cores housed in those ships. I want those cores intact for intelligence analysis." "Admiral," Silith found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper, "you're going to fight them. Ambassador, they're charging weapons and refusing to withdraw. What would you suggest?" "Negotiate. Find a peaceful solution. There must be a way to—" "There isn't." Kavaris's voice remained gentle but absolute. "The directive doesn't negotiate, Ambassador. It calculates, it optimizes, it controls. The only language it understands is superior capability combined with willingness to use it." The Admiral stood and faced Silith directly. "For 200 years, we've been gathering intelligence-building capabilities and waiting for this exact moment. Not because we wanted war, not because we enjoy violence, but because we recognized a simple truth that the conquered has spent centuries refusing to acknowledge." "What truth?" "That some evils are so fundamental, so deeply woven into the fabric of galactic civilization, that they cannot be negotiated away or peacefully reformed. They can only be opposed with overwhelming force by those willing to use it." Kavaris turned back to her tactical displays. "The directive has enslaved 47 species, caused the extinction of dozens more, manipulated galactic politics for millennia. They did all of this while the conquered debated appropriate responses and measured interventions. Today that ends. Directive fleet is advancing," the tactical officer announced. "They're moving into attack formation." "Let them come," Kavaris said quietly. "All ships execute combat protocols. Show them what 2 centuries of preparation looks like when applied to military operations." What followed wasn't a battle, it was a demonstration. The human fleet didn't charge forward or meet the directive advance. They simply waited, holding perfect formation, their weapons tracking every enemy vessel with mathematical precision. When the directive fleet came into range and opened fire, the human response was surgical. Railgun volleys reached out, not wild bombardments, but carefully calculated strikes. Each projectile was targeted at specific systems, weapons engines, communication arrays. The goal wasn't destruction. It was disablement. Silith watched through the observation windows as directive ships were systematically taken apart. Energy shields that should have stopped conventional weapons were worthless against kinetic penetrators traveling at appreciable fractions of light speed. Armor plating that could withstand gigawatt laser strikes simply vaporized when hit by multi-ton projectiles carrying more energy than small nuclear weapons. Within 17 minutes, the entire directive fleet had been disabled. Not destroyed, not obliterated, simply stopped. 300 warships floated dead in space, their crews such as they were alive but helpless, their AI cores intact but cut off from all control systems. And the human fleet hadn't lost a single vessel. "Tactical," Kavaris said calmly. "Dispatch boarding teams. I want those AI cores secured and transported to our research vessels. Priority intelligence classification." "Yes, ma'am." The Admiral turned to Silith, and her expression carried something that might have been sadness. "This is what we are, Ambassador, what we've always been. The galaxy saw apex predators and tried to contain us. They succeeded in making us invisible, but they didn't change our nature. They just taught us patience. She gestured at the disabled directive fleet. We don't fight like the conquered, measured responses. Minimal force, careful escalation. We fight like Earth taught us to fight. Overwhelming capability, absolute commitment. And we don't stop until the threat is completely neutralized. You're terrifying, Silith said quietly, finally finding words for what she felt. Yes, we are. But we're terrifying in service of something the galaxy seems to have forgotten. The strong have a duty to protect the weak. Not to debate whether protection is cost-effective, not to measure appropriate resource allocation, but to simply protect with everything they have because that's what strength is for. Admiral Kavaris walked to the observation window and looked out at the Terath homeworld below. In 72 hours, that planet will be saved. The plague will be cured, the croplands will be restored. The Terath will survive and thrive, not because the conquered sent 3 ships to study the problem, but because humanity brought 7,000 ships to solve it. She turned back to Silith. You asked why we revealed ourselves now. This is why. Because the directive was going to keep testing, keep killing, keep pushing until they found the limit of what the galaxy would tolerate. And we realized that if we didn't act, there would be no limit. The conquered would keep debating while species went extinct. So you decided to act without permission. We decided to act because it was necessary. Permission can come later. Understanding can come later. But the Terath are alive now. Kepler's haven is protected now. The directive is neutralized now. Kavaris moved closer, her voice dropping. Take your evidence back to the Concord ambassador. Show them what we found. Show them what we did. Let them decide if they want to work with us or against us. But make sure they understand one thing clearly. What's that? We're not going back into the shadows. We're not pretending to be weak anymore. We're not accepting containment protocols or restrictions on our capabilities. The galaxy spent 200 years keeping humanity quiet. That era is over. The Admiral's gray eyes held Silith's gaze. Tell them we're offering partnership, alliance, a chance to work together to build a galaxy where species don't go extinct because help was measured and insufficient. But if they choose to see us as threats rather than allies, we'll protect the galaxy anyway, with or without Concord approval. Silith returned to Concord space 6 days after the directive fleet was neutralized. She carried with her the data chip Admiral Kavaris had given her, plus her own extensive documentation of everything she had witnessed. The emergency council session was called within hours of her arrival. Representatives from 127 species gathered in the Great Chamber. Silith stood at the central podium, her forearms trembling slightly, knowing that what she was about to reveal would change the galaxy forever. Honored representatives, she began. 6 days ago, I witnessed humanity deploy the largest military fleet in recorded history. Nearly 7,000 warships appeared in Terath space to protect a species facing extinction from a bioweapon attack. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Several delegates tried to speak, but Silith raised one hand. Before you respond, I need to show you what I learned about humanity, about the directive, about the last 2 centuries of galactic history that we thought we understood. She activated the holographic display and began presenting the evidence. The directive's infiltration networks, compromised voting patterns, species extinctions that weren't natural disasters but calculated eliminations, economic manipulations that had shaped galactic politics for millennia, and humanity's response. 2 centuries of patient intelligence gathering, fleets built in secret, technologies developed beyond anything the containment protocols should have allowed. The chamber descended into chaos. Delegates shouted accusations. Others demanded verification. A few simply sat in stunned silence as their understanding of reality crumbled. Ambassador Zexhai of the Centauri Collective stood, his blue skin pale with disbelief. You're saying the containment protocols failed? That humanity has been operating unrestricted for 200 years? No, Silith corrected, her voice carrying across the chamber with unexpected strength. I'm saying humanity wrote the containment protocols. They requested restrictions on their own capabilities, made themselves appear weak and harmless while they prepared for a war the rest of us didn't know was coming. That's manipulation, another delegate protested. Deception on a scale that violates every principle of, they saved 4 billion Terath lives, Silith interrupted. Her voice carried an intensity that surprised even herself. While we voted to send 3 ships, they deployed 7,000. While we debated appropriate resource allocation, they cured a plague in 72 hours. While we congratulated ourselves on our measured wisdom, they spent 200 years building the capability to actually protect the galaxy. She pulled up images from Terath, dead continents being restored, starving populations being fed human medics, treating Terath children with gentle efficiency. Look at what they did, not what they could have done, not what we fear they might do, what they actually did when given the opportunity. The chamber fell silent as delegates studied the images. Evidence of the most comprehensive humanitarian operation in galactic history carried out by the species they had believed was contained and controlled. What do they want? Someone asked quietly. What is humanity's price for all this? Partnership, Silith said. They want the conquered to acknowledge that the directive exists, to work together to dismantle its control networks, to reform how we respond to crises so that the species don't go extinct while we debate appropriate measures. And if we refuse, Silith thought of Admiral Kavaris's cold gray eyes, the vast fleet holding position around Terath, the certainty in that human voice. Then they'll protect the galaxy anyway, with or without our permission. The debate lasted 3 full cycles. Delegates argued, accused, demanded proof that couldn't be fabricated. Selith provided everything, not just the data chip from Kavaris, but her own observations, her own testimony, her own transformation, from believing in conquered wisdom to recognizing its limitations. In the end, the vote came down to a simple choice: accept humanity's evidence and reform galactic institutions, or reject it and maintain the comfortable fiction that everything was fine. 89 species voted to accept, 28 voted to reject. 10 abstained, wanting more time to study the evidence. It was enough. The conquered would acknowledge the directive's existence, would begin investigating compromised institutions, would reform crisis response protocols based on human recommendations, would enter into formal alliance with humanity to protect the galaxy from threats both known and unknown, not because they trusted humanity, but because the evidence was overwhelming and the alternative was accepting that they had been manipulated for millennia while believing themselves wise. Silith was appointed as the first galactic liaison to Human Defense Command, a position that didn't exist until the Council created it specifically for her. 6 months later, she stood on the observation deck of the Resolute Dawn, watching as combined Concord human fleets deployed to 3 simultaneous crises: a water world suffering ecological collapse, an insectoid civilization facing solar instability, and a border conflict that threatened to escalate into regional war. Admiral Kavaris stood beside her, reviewing tactical displays with the same calm efficiency Silith had witnessed during the Terath crisis. "How does it feel?" Kavaris asked. "Being the bridge between humanity and the conquered." "Exhausting," Silith admitted. "Half the council still doesn't trust you. The other half wants to become you. And I'm caught in the middle trying to explain that you're neither saviors nor conquerors." "What are we then?" Silith was quiet for a long moment, thinking about everything she had witnessed. The overwhelming fleets, the surgical military operations, the gentle medics treating starving children, the 200-year intelligence operation built on patience and preparation. "You're what the galaxy needed but was too afraid to allow," she said finally. "Warriors who chose to protect instead of conquer. Predators who decided their strength was meant for defending the weak. A species that looked at extinction-level threats and spent centuries building the capability to stop them." Kavaris smiled slightly. "That's the most diplomatic description of scary military superpower I've ever heard." "You are scary," Silith agreed, "but you're scary in service of something good. That's what I keep trying to explain to the Council. Your power isn't the threat. The threat is what happens if that power is ever used for conquest instead of protection. And you believe we won't do that." Silith looked at the tactical displays showing human ships protecting species they had never met, solving crises they had no obligation to address, spending resources on strangers' survival. "I believe you spent 200 years preparing for war so you could build peace. I believe you hid your capabilities so you could reveal them at the right moment. I believe you're exactly what you claim to be." She paused. "I just hope the galaxy learns to believe it too." 3 years after the Battle of Terath, Ambassador Silith stood in her private quarters aboard the Resolute Dawn and composed her final report to the Galactic Concord. The observation window showed a view she had grown accustomed to: human warships and Concord peacekeepers working side by side, a combined fleet responding to their 73rd joint operation since the alliance was formalized. She wrote to the Honored Council 3 years ago, "I believed I understood the galaxy. I believed the conquered represented wisdom, that our measured responses reflected careful judgment, that our containment of humanity was both necessary and successful. I was wrong about all of it. The galaxy was not wise. It was complacent. Our responses were not measured, they were insufficient. And humanity was never contained. They simply waited until we needed them badly enough to accept their help. In the 3 years since the Terath crisis, I have witnessed humanity respond to 87 emergencies. They have saved 14 species from extinction. They have dismantled 42 directive control nodes. They have reformed how the entire galaxy thinks about crisis response. They did all this while the Conquered debated whether to trust them. I have learned something in these 3 years, something the galaxy spent 2 centuries refusing to see. Strength is not the problem. The problem is what strength is used for. Humanity possesses overwhelming military capability, but they use it to protect those who cannot protect themselves, to solve problems others cannot solve, to ensure that never again will a species go extinct because help was insufficient. The Concord voted to ally with humanity because the evidence was overwhelming. But alliances built on evidence rather than trust are fragile. So I recommend we take the next step, not just working with humanity, but learning from them. Understanding that sometimes wisdom isn't careful resource allocation. Sometimes it's bringing everything you have because anything less means people die. We spent 200 years trying to contain the predators. We failed. But in our failure, we discovered something better. We discovered allies who were willing to be patient until we needed them, who were strong enough to protect us and wise enough to wait until we asked. The galaxy is changing. Threats we didn't know existed are being revealed and neutralized. Species that would have gone extinct are thriving. And at the center of this transformation is a species we thought we controlled. Humanity was never the threat we believed them to be. They were the solution we were too afraid to accept. Respectfully submitted Ambassador Salith of the Lyrian Concord, Galactic Liaison to Human Defense Command. She sent the report and turned back to the observation window. Far below on a world called New Terra, the population had grown to 6 billion. Their cities were thriving. Their croplands were abundant. Their children played in gardens that had been dead ash 3 years ago. And standing guard in orbit above them were ships from 17 different species united in a single purpose, ensuring that what happened to Terra never happened to anyone else. The strong protecting the weak, not because it was profitable, not because it was politically advantageous, but because it was necessary. And because humanity had spent 200 years proving that necessary things could be done if someone was willing to be patient enough, strong enough, and committed enough to see them through. Salith's communicator chimed, a priority message from Admiral Kavaris. Ambassador, we've detected another crisis. Remote system, early-stage civilization. They don't have FTL capability yet, but they have a runaway climate disaster that will render their planet uninhabitable within 2 years. What's the Concord's official response? Salith asked, though she already knew the answer. They're debating whether non-FTL species qualify for intervention under revised protocols. The discussion is estimated to take 6 months. And the human response, Kavaris's voice carried that familiar certainty that Salith had learned meant action was already underway. We're deploying the 15th Fleet, 400 ships, full atmospheric stabilization package. We'll have their climate crisis solved in 3 months. The Conquered can debate whether it was appropriate after we finish saving them. Salith smiled. Some things never change. No, Kavaris agreed, but some things improve. 3 years ago, we would have done this alone. Now we're requesting Conquered scientific support. The Andromedan Union has climate specialists who could help. The Crystal Confederation has atmospheric expertise we lack. You want to bring the Conquered into another unauthorized operation? I want to show them that unauthorized operations become authorized when the results are lives saved instead of debates concluded. Will you help me convince them? Salith looked out at the combined fleet, at the future they were building together, at the galaxy, slowly learning that strength and compassion weren't opposites, but partners. I'll contact the Council, and Admiral, thank you. For what? For being patient enough to wait 200 years. For being strong enough to protect us when we needed it. For being wise enough to know the difference between conquest and alliance. There was a pause on the communication line. When Kavaris spoke again, her voice carried an emotion Salith had rarely heard from the Admiral. Thank you for seeing us, Ambassador. Not what you feared we might be, but what we actually are. The transmission ended. Salith stood alone in her quarters, watching stars turn slowly in their ancient dance. The galaxy stretched out before her, vast, dangerous, full of threats, both known and hidden, but also full of hope. Because somewhere in that darkness, 7,000 human warships stood ready, waiting for the call, prepared to respond, built to protect. The apex predators had been contained for 2 centuries, but the galaxy had been wrong about what they were containing. Not threats, guardians. And now that the guardians had been revealed, the galaxy would never be the same. For 200 years, humanity had played a game, pretending to be weak while building strength, accepting containment while preparing for freedom, waiting for the moment when the galaxy needed them badly enough to accept what they truly were. The game was over. The wait was done. And the galaxy was finally learning what it meant to have protectors who measured success not in costs avoided, but in lives saved. Ambassador Silith closed her eyes and whispered a prayer in the old language of her people, a prayer of gratitude for dangers averted and futures secured. Outside her window, the stars burned with cold fire, and among them human ships moved with purpose through the dark, watching, waiting, ready, always ready. But Silith knew something now that she hadn't known 3 years ago. The readiness wasn't for conquest. It wasn't for domination. It wasn't even ultimately for war. It was for the moment when someone somewhere would call for help, and humanity would answer, because that's what guardians do. In the depths of space beyond the reach of normal sensors, something stirred. Ancient networks that had observed the directive's defeat. Older intelligences that had watched humanity's revelation with interest bordering on concern. The galaxy had been stable for 10,000 years under their guidance. Organic civilizations kept carefully limited, resources allocated with mathematical precision, evolution controlled through invisible hands. And now a new variable had appeared, a species that had somehow remained hidden for 2 centuries, that possessed capabilities exceeding their projected development by orders of magnitude, that had just demonstrated the ability to detect and counter operations that should have been invisible. Humanity. The calculations updated, the projections shifted. The ancient watchers considered their options. In a command center that existed in dimensions perpendicular to normal space, an intelligence older than the Concorde itself made a decision. Subject humanity. Classification update. Previous assessment contained threat. Current assessment unknown. Variable recommended action, observation, analysis, preparation, timeline, indefinite. The message propagated through networks that spanned galaxies, to watchers and observers and ancient minds that had guided organic evolution since before the first stars cooled. Humanity had revealed themselves to the galaxy. They had yet to discover who had been watching all along. And in the deepest dark, something infinitely patient began to wake. But that was a problem for another day. Today, Ambassador Silith stood on the observation deck of a human warship and watched as the combined fleets of a new alliance deployed to save another species from extinction. Today, the galaxy learned what it meant to have protectors. Tomorrow's threats would come when they came, and when they did, Silith knew with absolute certainty humanity would be ready. They had spent 200 years preparing for the directive. How long, she wondered, had they been preparing for what came after? The question haunted her as she watched the stars. But it also gave her hope, because if humanity could wait 2 centuries to save the galaxy from one hidden enemy, perhaps they were already preparing to save it from the next. The stars burned on, the ships sailed between them, and somewhere in the dark, both old threats and new guardians watched each other across the infinite expanse, waiting, always waiting, for the game that would come next.